button. Hello, YouTube. I hope you don't hear faintly in the background the sound of my home phone going off for some reason. I'm not going to get that. I am I'm about to read chapter 2 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Where we last left off, we were finishing chapter 1 and talking about sort of these ideas of liberation. We were talking about the ideas of having revolutionary leadership and how, there has to be an avoidance of sectarianism. There has to be a work towards not becoming sectarian not becoming sectarian about your opposition, not becoming sectarian about people within your ranks, having a radical consciousness about that. Let me look this over really quickly for a second. We closed off on this quote. The method is the external form of consciousness manifest in acts, which takes on the fundamental property of consciousness, its intentionality. The essence of consciousness is being with the world, and this behavior is permanent and unavoidable. Accordingly, consciousness is in essence a way towards something apart from itself, outside itself, which surrounds it, in which it apprehends by means of its ideational capacity. Consciousness is thus by definition a method in the most general sense of the word. This is a quote from Álvaro Vieira Pinto. And yeah, I think even when we think about this word unavoidable, we often think about something that we can't help but do. But I think in the context of this book, and what he's saying here, the consciousness is not unavoidable in that sense, in terms of like it's habitually unavoidable, but that it's unavoidable in order to do what we are trying to do, right? Hopefully it would become habitual, but ultimately it's unavoidable if we are still talking about revolutionary thought. If we're still talking about not just revolutionary thought in the sense of planning a revolution of some type of armed insurrection, but talking about the type of things that it'll take to change the world, the type of dialogue that we need to have between each other. And that has to include a freedom for the person that you are speaking to. It has to include a freedom for yourself. It has to include understanding yourself as both subject and object, and understanding others as both subject and object, and thus is not as objective things that are subject to be the same forever, that you will always have deep understanding of no matter what they tell you, and not as subjects where everybody is just completely subjective and everything's totally fine and there's no reason to have any type of disagreement type of thing because everything is subjective. Any leaning towards one of the other, objectivism or subjectivism, will be a problem. This thing is gonna drive me insane. And so more than anything, it's important to not only take a consciousness, right? Gain a consciousness of how the world works as much as we can, learning about issues in different countries and all of that, but also to view that as something to participate in, as something to act upon, as something that should be changed, right? If you don't have that understanding, then what are you really going to do, right? Other than reinforce the problem, even though you know it's already a problem, which makes you perhaps an even more deeply entrenched and more dangerous sort of actor in terms of reinforcing the problem. Kaylin says, I was literally talking about this chapter today with a friend. Learning about the banking concept of education really helped me understand how a lot of people, particularly adults, engage with information nowadays. That's a really important point. Animated human, can you also talk about being white and hence also being part of the oppressive structure? I'm from India, where I belong to the upper caste, who have historically oppressed lower caste people. Right, so I'm not quite white. I'm whitish, right? I have always been racialized as Asian, and I am, in fact, 25% Chinese. I've always been racialized as, like, mixed East Asian. Often I get guesses, are you Filipino? Are you some type of Singaporean? Are you some type of... Korean. I get Korean a lot, but I am in fact a mix of, well, technically I have a lot of different ancestry in terms of ethnicity and race, but I have a grandfather who was from China. I have a grandmother who was white. I have a grandmother who is mixed. I have a grandfather who was like light and mixed. And so what I am is essentially kind of Asian. And so that definitely allows me, puts me in a certain place in terms of how I'm presenting myself, in terms of how people see me. It affords me a certain amount of privilege, although privilege might not even be the best way to describe it. Not to abdicate myself of some type of responsibility to understanding my, positionality of power over other people oftentimes. But in the sense that it's more so about carrying on a type of oppression, oftentimes unwittingly, by reinforcing that certain things are better than others. And you have to constantly be in a process when you are a person of an upper class, of an upper caste, that ultimately I need to be much more willing to deconstruct some of the things that I'm holding on to about myself that I need to have, or that I need to be, or that I am good because of. And especially I need to be constantly engaged in listening to people who are speaking in different parts of the caste system, who are working class, who are if it's in the case of the Indian caste system, who belong to a different sort of ethnic group, a different race, and a different class positionality, as we kind of conceive it in English, right? People who have less than me, people who are suffering and who have an understanding of their suffering, right? Because there are going to be people who are suffering a lot and also have bad ideas because they're not thinking dialogically, they're not thinking in terms of liberation. But in general, just listening to people overall, right, instead of rushing to classify them, is a key part of this book. And especially being a person who, knowing that I have ties to the oppressor class from my biological sort of affiliations, that because I have that affiliation, because I have those roots, I have to be extra judicious about taking things out of myself, like removing things from myself and from my conception of the world, from my actions, my behavior, right? So this is kind of how I try to conceive it, and I think this is kind of the Freirean, closer to the Freirean way of conceiving things. Freirean way. I'm so used to saying Paulo Freire, even though it's Freire, because I always heard people say Freire, right? And then I just started saying Freire, and it's Freirean. It's Paulo Freire, right? I'm really kind of interested in getting into chapter 2 and how it talks about specifically the education system, but also there's so much to draw from his commentary on the education system, not only to support the points he's made so far, but also getting into, as Kaylin was sort of talking about, the way we treat information. We have a bad relationship with information. This is something that I am covering in this narcissism video that I've just talked about. But just in general, a lot of what the work is on this channel is trying to not only get the right information, but like engage with it properly. That is to say, dialogically. That is to say, never assuming I know too much, I know everything, never assuming certain people are to be taken at their word no matter what, but also at the same time, constantly being open to new information, constantly being open to different accounts and perspectives and subjectivities. That's a lot of rambling, but epistemology is another good word. That's a lot of rambling, but let's get to it. This is chapter 2. Setting up my mic. A careful analysis of the teacher-student relationship at any level, inside or outside the school, reveals its fundamentally narrative character. This relationship involves a narrating subject, the teacher, and patient, listening objects, the students. The contents, whether values or empirical dimensions of reality, tend in the process of being narrated to become lifeless and petrified. Education is suffering from narration sickness. This is like a great sentence to lead off and something to keep in mind. The teacher talks about reality as if it were motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable. Or else he expounds on a topic completely alien to the existential experience of the students. His task is to fill the students with the contents of his narration, contents which are detached from reality, disconnected from the totality that engendered them and could give them significance. Words are emptied of their concreteness and become a hollow, alienated, and alienating verbosity. The outstanding characteristic of this narrative education, then, is the sonority of words, not their transforming power. 4 times 4 is 16. The capital of Para is Belém. The student records, memorizes, and repeats these phrases without perceiving what 4 times 4 really means or realizing the true significance of capital in the affirmation, the capital of Para is Belém. That is, what Belém means for Para and what Para means for Brazil. Narration, with the teacher as narrator, leads the students to memorize mechanically the narrated content. Worse yet, it turns them into containers, into receptacles to be filled by the teacher. The more completely she fills the receptacles, the better a teacher she is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. And so if you've seen also our sort of work about the education systems on our channel, you'll kind of see that we take a lot from that idea. The banking idea of education is what he's going to get into here. And that has to, if you bank something in something, right? There's a concept of emptiness. If you put something in something else, it is open. It is a receptacle to be having things placed in it. And to think of other people's brains in that way is at once both second nature at this point for many of us, and also deeply problematic, let's say. Education thus becomes an act of depositing, in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. Instead of communicating, the teacher issues communiques and makes deposits which the students patiently receive, memorize, and repeat. This is the banking concept of education, in which the scope of action allowed to the students extends only as far as receiving, filing, and storing the deposits. They do, it is true, have the opportunity to become collectors or catalogers of the things they store. But in the last analysis, it is the people themselves who are filed away through the lack of creativity, transformation, and knowledge in this, at best, misguided system. For apart from inquiry, apart from the praxis, individuals cannot truly be human. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention. Through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those who they consider to know nothing. Projecting an absolute ignorance onto others, a characteristic of the ideology of oppression, negates education and knowledge as processes of inquiry. The teacher presents himself to his students as their necessary opposite. By considering their ignorance absolute, he justifies his own existence. The students, alienated like the slave in the Hegelian dialectic, accept their ignorance as justifying the teacher's existence. But, unlike the slave, they never discover that they educate the teacher. And this is the construct that comes up a lot when I talk about this, that seems to come up a lot with this book and Freire, is the teacher as student and the student as teacher. This is a great conceptualization of this idea of how to debunk, how to work against the banking concept. The raison d'etre of libertarian education, on the other hand, lies in its drive towards reconciliation. Education must begin with the solution of the teacher-student contradiction by reconciling the poles of the contradiction so that both are simultaneously teachers and students. This solution is not, nor can it be, found in the banking concept. On the contrary, banking education maintains and even stimulates the contradiction through the following attitudes and practices which mirror oppressive society as a whole. A. The teacher teaches and the students are taught. B. The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. C. The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. D. The teacher talks and the students listen meekly. E. The teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. F. The teacher chooses and enforces his choice and the students comply. G. The teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting through the action of the teacher. H. The teacher chooses the program content and the students who were not consulted adapt to it. I. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his or her own professional authority, which she and he sets in opposition to the freedom of the students. J. The teacher is the subject of the learning process, while the pupils are mere objects. I think Jay gets at it in a very strong existential philosophical way, right? It is not surprising that the banking concept of education regards men as adaptable, manageable beings. The more students work at storing the deposits entrusted to them, the less they develop the critical consciousness which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of that world. The more completely they accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend simply to adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in them. I like this phrasing, accepting the passive role, as like this kind of construct, this way of understanding, then also like what that does to a person over time. And that's what Freire is saying. You're taught from a very early age to accept the passive role and to accept this other person's viewpoint and knowledge, this other construction of viewpoints and knowledge created by power, created by institutions, as the truth, and you as a passive actor in it. You have no active role. You can't change history. You can't examine history even for a critical, way. It's all out of your hands. And we've all got it figured out, so just repeat after us, The capability of banking education to minimize or annul the students' creative power and to stimulate their credulity serves the interests of the oppressors, who care neither to have the world revealed nor to see it transformed. The oppressors use their humanitarianism to preserve a profitable situation. Thus, they react almost instinctively against any experiment in education which stimulates the critical faculties and is not content with a partial view of reality, but always seeks out the ties which link one point to another and one problem to another. And April, you're on point there. This does sound like the adult-child relationship, right? Very, very important, to see that in the adult-child relationship, as we commonly see it, right? Adults treat the children, you're a receptacle, you follow what I say, you're a passive actor, and you will stay a passive actor, and I'm doing this because I love you, Indeed, the interests of the oppressors lie in changing the consciousness of the oppressed, not the situation which oppresses them. For the more the oppressed can be led to adapt to that situation, the more easily they can be dominated. Note 1, Simone de Beauvoir, La pensée de droite aujourd'hui. So that's Simone de Beauvoir. To achieve this end, the oppressors use the banking concept of education in conjunction with a paternalistic social action apparatus, within which the oppressed receive the euphemistic title of welfare recipients. They are treated as individual cases, as marginal persons who deviate from the general configuration of a good, organized, and just society. The oppressed are regarded as the pathology of the healthy society, which must therefore adjust these incompetent and lazy folk to its own patterns by changing their mentality. That's the broke mentality that people love to talk about, right? These marginals need to be incorporated into the healthy society that they have forsaken. The truth is, however, that the oppressed are not marginals, are not people living outside society. They have always been inside the structure which made them beings for others. The solution is not to integrate them into the structure of oppression, but to transform that structure so that they can become beings for themselves. Excuse me? Hey, Vincent. Such transformation, of course, would undermine the oppressors' purposes, hence their utilization of the banking concept of education to avoid the threat of student conscientisation. The banking approach to adult education, for example, will never propose to students that they critically consider reality. It will deal instead with such vital questions as whether Roger gave green grass to the goat, and insist upon the importance of learning that, on the contrary, Roger gave green grass to the rabbit. The humanism of the banking approach masks the efforts to turn women and men into automatons, the very negation of their ontological vocation to be more fully human. And that's where you have to look out for humanism in philosophy. It's an important construct. It's an important thing to consider oneself a lot of the time. But oftentimes it's a very kind of contentious term, because what does it mean to be humanistic, right? A lot of the times we think, I want to be I'm humanist, and our ideas of how to be humanist and how to help people, how to liberate people, how to save people are based in them being these passive objects to be saved, right? Instead of us thinking to ourselves, well, let me actually listen to what those people want and need and understand it, you know? Those who use the banking approach, knowingly or unknowingly, for there are innumerable well-intentioned bank clerk teachers who do not realize that they are serving only to dehumanize, fail to perceive that the deposits themselves contain contradictions about reality. What's up, Debbie? But sooner or later, these contradictions may lead formerly passive students to turn against their domestication and the attempt to domesticate reality. They may discover through existential experience that their present way of life is irreconcilable with their vocation to become fully human. They may perceive through their relations with reality that reality is really a process undergoing constant transformation. This is something I always go back to too, this idea of reality as a process. I talk about this a lot. When people ask me a lot of questions, I usually go back to that. If men and women are searchers and their ontological vocation is humanization, sooner or later they may perceive the contradiction in which banking education seeks to maintain them, and then engage themselves in the struggle for their liberation. But the humanist, revolutionary educator cannot wait for this possibility to materialize. From the outset, her efforts must coincide with those of the students to engage in critical thinking and the quest for mutual humanization. His efforts must be imbued with a profound trust in people and their creative power. To achieve this, they must be partners of the students in their relations with them. The banking concept does not admit to such partnership, and necessarily so. To resolve the teacher-student contradiction, to exchange the role of depositor, prescriber, domesticator for the role of student among students would be to undermine the power of oppression and to serve the cause of liberation. Implicit in the banking concept is the assumption of a dichotomy between human beings and the world. A person is merely in the world, not with the world or with others. The individual is a spectator, not recreator. In this view, the person is not a conscious being, corpo consciente. He or she is rather the possessor of a consciousness, I should say. An empty mind, passively open to the reception of deposits of reality from the world outside. For example, my desk, my books, my coffee cup, all the objects before me, as bits of the world which surround me, would be inside me, exactly as I am inside my study right now. This view makes no distinction between being accessible to consciousness and entering consciousness. The distinction, however, is essential. The objects which surround me are simply accessible to my consciousness, not located within it. I am aware of them, but they are not inside me. It follows logically from the banking notion of consciousness that the educator's role is to regulate the way the world enters into the students. The teacher's task is to organize a process which already occurs spontaneously, to fill the students by making deposits of information which he or she considers to constitute true knowledge. Note 2, this concept corresponds to what Sartre calls the digestive or nutritive concept of education, in which knowledge is fed by the teacher to the students to fill them out. See Jean-Paul Sartre, Une idée fondamentale de la phénoménologie de Husserl, la intentionnalité. Again, not a French speaker. I am not a French speaker. Leo says, I just started college and I was shocked that when I told by my older relatives that I would like to have more freedom in my studies, that I need to be taught the bases before having my own ideas. And I realized it's what was said to me for my whole scholarity. That's exactly, like, I think a very strong sort of encapsulation of that. And I think it's also kind of a bastardization of a truth, which is that, yes, you need to have basic building blocks, right? Fundamental building blocks and simple things in mind, structures in mind, through which you can work on other stuff. But at the same time, how much of that is true, especially when it comes to really learning about the world, and especially when it comes to then viewing that process as being drilled a bunch of stuff for years and years that you unconditionally accept as true, essentially, before being able to say, let me think about this, right? A lot of the time, you don't really need to do that in order to figure out why that stuff is wrong. And since people receive the world as passive entities, education should make them more passive still and adapt them to the world. The educated individual is the adapted person because she or he is better fit for the world. Translated into practice, this concept is well suited to the purposes of the oppressors, whose tranquility rests on how well people fit the world the oppressors have created and how little they question it. The more completely the majority adapt to the purposes which the dominant minority prescribe for them, thereby depriving them of the right to their own purposes, the more easily the minority can continue to prescribe. The theory and practice of banking education serve this end quite efficiently. Verbalistic lessons, reading requirements, the methods for evaluating knowledge, the distance between the teacher and the taught, the criteria for promotion, everything in this ready-to-wear approach serves to obviate thinking. Note 3. For example, some professors specify in their reading lists that a book should be read from pages 10 to 15 and do this to help their students. The bank clerk educator does not realize that there is no true security in his hypertrophied role, that one must seek to live with others in solidarity. One cannot impose oneself, nor even merely coexist with one's students. Solidarity requires true communication, and the concept by which such an educator is guided fears and prescribes communication. Yet only through communication can human life hold meaning. That's a big sentence, right? Only through communication can human life hold meaning. The teacher's thinking is authenticated only by the authenticity of the student's thinking. The teacher cannot think for her students, nor can she impose her thought on them. Authentic thinking, thinking that is concerned about reality, does not take place in ivory tower isolation, but only in communication. If it is true that thought has meaning only when generated by action upon the world, the subordination of students to teachers becomes impossible. Because banking education begins with a false understanding of men and women as objects, it cannot promote the development of what Fromm calls biophily, but instead produces its opposite, necrophily. While life is characterized by growth in a structured, functional manner, the necrophilous person loves all that does not grow, all that is mechanical. The necrophilous person is driven by the desire to transform the organic into the inorganic, to approach life mechanically, as if all living persons were things. Memory rather than experience, having rather than being is what counts. The necrophilous person can relate to an object, a flower or a person, only if he possesses it. Hence, a threat to his possession is a threat to himself. If he loses possession, he loses contact with the world. He loves control, and in the act of controlling, he kills life. Note 4 from opposite, page 41. So, siren. But, this is just in essence sort of reinforcing, I think, what Freire is saying, to speak to Sarah's confusion, I think. rather than speaking about life, which is life that is communication, right? Life that is constant process. I don't remember how I started that sentence. We can construe life as that, right? Freddie establishes that life is communication. So what's the opposite of communication? The opposite of communication is, well, it's kind of complicated, actually, if you think about it. Because there really can't be a conceptualized concept of communication, the opposite of communication, for an easy human behavior example. Why? Because we understand communication as inherently about the transfer of information, the transfer of sentiment, the coordination, the relation between people. What's up, L? So you can't have communication if it's just one person, right? In a way, you can't, unless you're talking about internal communication, maybe. Communication is inherently about having two parties. And even if one party is the only one talking, the other party has to be receiving in an active way, right? Otherwise, it's not really communicating. So likewise, biophily recognizes life as something that has to take place between multiple people, and thus is communication, and thus is always a process, right? Because it can't be just something that just happens straightforwardly, once, structuredly, with no other way to contextualize it, no other way to make an example of it, no other way to understand it. It has to be something that is constantly processed, motion. Necrophily then instead is characterized by structure, like life characterizing life by structure, functionality, solely, right? Growth in a structured, functional manner. The necrophilist person loves all that does not grow, all that is mechanical. I actually kind of misspoke there. So yeah, the necrophilist person loves things that are mechanical, right? Things that do not have motion, things that are still, right? Like a machine is something that sits still and waits for you to use it. No? Like it doesn't move unless you tell it to move, and you have to put the input in that is the same inputs, and then it will move in the way that it will always move, right? That's what a machine does. Whereas life is not about that, right? There's always inherently some type of freedom and some type of question, some type of process that happens between the different parties involved in a communication. And so that's why the necrophilist person is sort of this concept of like, we are not trying to look at people as alive. We're trying to look at people as machines. And this is what we do when we, for instance, say, people will always do this. And so that's why you have to act this way. That is looking at the world in a mechanical way. Humans are always going to be inherently evil. And so we have to act in this way to protect ourselves from them. That's a mechanical way of thinking. You don't look at it as a process that's dialectical, as a process at all. You look at it as an input. And that is the difference. That is the thing that we have to work on avoiding, right? And there's a lot of interesting sort of overlap and analysis that can be done from like a neurodivergent perspective, because a lot of the times folks like us who are neurodivergent, we try to think about things in terms of inputs, right? Because we've been so conditioned, and because we have such a different sort of way of processing life, such a difficulty oftentimes processing life, and like inputting the same thing and receiving the same experience as the people around us by and large. We're constantly thinking of life in a way of, okay, what do I put in so that I can get this out? And when we do that, we're wandering down a very, very dangerous road, because there is a very, very slippery slope between that and manipulation and fascism, as Leo points out, and necrophily, as Fromm might articulate it. Because instead of viewing this human process as complicated, and as process, as motion, constant motion that we can never just get a hold of, we are often tempted to say, I have to act the same way. I have to act the right way. I have to do this right thing so that I can get the right thing out. And then when we do the thing and then we don't get the thing out that we want, we're like, what the fuck? What's the problem? Right? Someone's speaking Japanese in the chat, and I'm not sure what they're saying. But if somebody can translate, that'd be great. Oppression, overwhelming control, is necrophilic. It is nourished by love of death, not life. The banking concept of education, which serves the interests of oppression, is also necrophilic. Based on a mechanistic, static, naturalistic, spatialized view of consciousness, it transforms students into receiving objects. Right? The students are not receiving the objects. The students are receiving objects, right? They are objects that receive. Oh, hello, how are you? Thank you, April. Transactional, yeah, transactional is another good term for this, right? It attempts to control thinking and action, leads women and men to adjust to the world, and inhibits their creative power. When their efforts to act responsibly are frustrated, when they find themselves unable to use their faculties, people suffer. This suffering due to impotence is rooted in the very fact that the human equilibrium has been disturbed. Number 5, Ibid, page 31. But the inability to act, which causes people's anguish, also causes them to reject their impotence by attempting... Sorry for bumping the desk a bunch. By attempting, quote, to restore... Let me not start saying quote unquote, because I'm going to get confused. To restore their capacity to act. But can they, and how? One way is to submit to and identify with a person or group having power. By this symbolic participation in another person's life, men have the illusion of acting, when in reality they only submit to and become a part of those who act. And that's from Ibid as well. Populist manifestations perhaps best exemplify this type of behavior by the oppressed, who, by identifying with charismatic leaders, come to feel that they themselves are active and effective. The rebellion they express as they emerge in the historical process is motivated by that desire to act effectively. The dominant elites consider the remedy to be more domination and repression, carried out in the name of freedom, order, and social peace. That is, the peace of the elites. Thus, they can condemn, logically from their point of view, the violence of a strike by workers, and can call upon the state in the same breath to use violence in putting down the strike. So that's note 7, Reinhold Niebuhr, Moral Man and Immoral Society, page 130. Education as the exercise of domination stimulates the credulity of students with the ideological intent, often not perceived by educators, of indoctrinating them to adapt to the world of oppression. This accusation is not made in the naive hope that the dominant elites will thereby simply abandon the practice. Its objective is to call the attention of true humanists to the fact that they cannot use banking educational methods in the pursuit of liberation, for they would only negate that very pursuit. Nor may a revolutionary society inherit these methods from an oppressor society. The revolutionary society which practices banking education is either misguided or mistrusting of people. In either event, it is threatened by the specter of reaction. Unfortunately, those who espouse the cause of liberation are themselves surrounded and influenced by the climate which generates the banking concept, and often do not perceive its true significance or its dehumanizing power. Paradoxically, then, they utilize this same instrument of alienation in what they consider an effort to liberate. Indeed, some revolutionaries brand as innocents, dreamers, or even reactionaries those who would challenge this educational practice. but one does not liberate people by alienating them. Authentic liberation, the process of humanization, is not another deposit to be made in men. Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it. Key sentence, maybe the quote of the book. Liberation is a praxis. What is a praxis? The action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it. It's not just the thinking, but it's the action. It's not just the action, but it's the thinking. That is what praxis is. That's what liberation is as well. And so, what was that noise? And so, what he's saying, like a lot of us internalize that this is the way to educate, is simply to bank into people, right? To operate with people as machines, ultimately. Instead of acting in practice with people, in practice with the world we live in, right? Those truly committed to the cause of liberation can accept neither the mechanistic concept of consciousness as an empty vessel to be filled, nor the use of banking methods of domination, propaganda, slogans, deposits, in the name of liberation. Those truly committed to liberation must reject the banking concept in its entirety, adopting instead a concept of women and men as conscious beings, and consciousness as consciousness intent upon the world. They must abandon the educational goal of deposit making and replace it with the posing of the problems of human beings in their relations with the world. Problem posing education, responding to the essence of consciousness, intentionality, rejects communiques and embodies communication. It epitomizes the special characteristic of consciousness, being conscious of, not only as intent on objects, but as turned in upon itself in a Jasperian split, consciousness as consciousness of consciousness. Liberating education consists in acts of cognition, not transferals of information. It is a learning situation in which the cognizable object, far from being the end of the cognitive act, intermediates the cognitive actors, teacher on the one hand and students on the other. Accordingly, the practice of problem-posing education entails at the outset that the teacher-student contradiction is to be resolved. Dialogical relations, indispensable to the capacity of cognitive actors to cooperate in perceiving the same cognizable object, are otherwise impossible. So again, similar to like resolving this is a big thing that Freire goes back to a lot, resolving the oppressor-oppressor contradiction. Now we're talking about resolving the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, Now we're talking about resolving the teacher-student contradiction. In both of these, there's a dialectic, right? Because we're trying to resolve a contradiction between two things and instead understand the relationality between them in actual life, which is the difference between saying teachers do this and students do this. This is their contradiction. And saying, this teacher that I had in 8th grade knew a lot about English, but also there were some things that they weren't sure about in terms of Black literature. And so they called upon us to offer potentially some things to read in class and gave some perspective about the authors we brought forward, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, and responded with also noting sometimes the things that they knew about these authors beforehand and sometimes the comparisons with the literature that they're aware of, right? And there was never a point in which I'm speaking completely in an imaginary scenario, right? But there's no point in which this teacher in my scenario is saying there's one way to know this. But there's also no point in which the teacher, when they have knowledge to share, is suppressing it in themselves and pretending that things that are not true are true. But it's relationality. It's understanding the dynamic that we have with that teacher that could only be understood by understanding the life that we were actually living instead of just putting some arbitrary category over something that is actual life. You can never break down life completely mechanistically. You have to break down life in terms of what it actually is. And so that's case-by-case basis oftentimes. That's context. That's observing context and absorbing it and then using it. Using context as knowledge that helps you resolve things in the present, rather than simply say, well, this is what it always is. Leo asks, do you think that there's some kind of analogy between education as banking and the Machist idea of penetration as the action of an active subject on a passive object? Yeah, I think that's also what Freire is getting at. Same thing with resolving subject-object contradiction. This is the same thing. Resolving oppressor-oppressed contradiction. Resolving teacher-student contradiction. That's what he's getting at. Rolnes C. ¿Qué? Sabía que hablabas español. Por cierto, tu editora es una youtuber. Sí, mi editora, yo creo que ella hace más transmisiones, live streams en Twitch. Pero yo creo que también ella a veces ha subido unos videos. No estoy tan seguro porque ella es un chin reservado sobre esas cosas, pero the fact that only my gender studies professors at my uni understood any of this is silly to me. But also it makes sense, right? Doesn't it make sense? It makes sense that they would be the ones to know. Indeed, problem-posing education, which breaks with the vertical patterns characteristic of banking education, can fulfill its function as the practice of freedom only if it can overcome the above contradiction. Through dialogue, the teacher of the students and the students of the teacher cease to exist and a new term emerges, teacher-student with students-teachers. The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with the students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. And I want to just interject really quickly and say, have you ever noticed, folks, like when you really are trying to teach somebody about something, trying to educate somebody about something, that often helps you to learn that thing better than ever before? That often teaching is the best way of learning and vice versa often? Like, that's what this is kind of getting at, right? When you're truly learning something, you're also teaching in a way. Because I'm interacting with something, and for example, I might notice some instances wherein this thing might be a little bit confusing or a little bit off, and I might consult with other sources, and I might try to explain it to somebody else in order to reflect that I have understood it, right? And also to reflect my current understanding of it and receive theirs. And especially so when it comes to, it's more simple when we come to understand it as part of the teaching process. It makes us learn, right? It helps us learn. Intercept asked, would it be accurate to say that a child would educate themselves about the world and how it operates if they were simply left alone? That is, the nature of a human/consciousness is self-educating. Not quite, because I think the point is that there's no such thing as leaving a person simply alone, right? It's not quite achievable. People, like, the whole thing of life is communication. Life is communication. It is a process. It's interacting with other people. And so the whole point is that, yes, we can teach children, but we also have to be just as receptive to what the children are teaching us and what we have to learn, if not specifically from the child themselves. And we cannot impose education on children. We have to invite education to learn. We have to invite children to learn with us. That's how children really learn. We have to invite them into our learning process instead of trying to impose knowledge into them. They become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. In this process, arguments based on authority are no longer valid. In order to function, authority must be on the side of freedom, not against it. Here, no one teaches another, nor is anyone self-taught. People teach each other, mediated by the world, by the cognizable objects, which in banking education are owned by the teacher. So that gets at the point I was just making. The banking concept, with its tendency to dichotomize everything, distinguishes two stages in the action of the educator. During the first, he cognizes a cognizable object while he prepares his lessons in his study or his laboratory. During the second, he expounds to his students about that object. The students are not called upon to know, but to memorize the contents narrated by the teacher. Nor do the students practice any act of cognition, since the object towards which that act should be directed is the property of the teacher rather than a medium evoking the critical reflection of both teacher and students. You kind of see what he's saying here too. Memorizing is not the same as learning. We all know this. We all know that, for instance, when we crammed for exams in school, we were hardly ever retaining any education, any information from that. That's why so many of us had gotten great grades in science classes, but we don't know anything about science at this moment because we just memorized, right? We didn't really get an understanding, a learning process. And that's due to a lot of the things, right? A lot of different things. And that doesn't just go for like straightforwardly like memorizing things like memorizing terminology, memorizing dates in history, right? Which we can clearly see as examples of that. But really all of it is memorizing, right? All of it is memorizing. Memorizing facts about science is still memorizing, even if it is like, oh, I can explain this thing I've memorized in some level of detail. If I don't have a real feeling, a real understanding of what that means when I'm saying it, even if I try to explain it, it's going to be awkward. It's not going to be fully fleshed out. It's just going to be memorized to the point of my necessity for having known it, which is to have answered it correctly in class. Hence, in the name of the preservation of culture and knowledge, we have a system which achieves neither true knowledge nor true culture. The problem-posing method does not dichotomize the activity of the teacher's student. She is not cognitive at one point and narrative at another. She is always cognitive, whether preparing a project or engaging in dialogue with the students. He does not regard cognizable objects as his private property, but as the object of reflection by himself and the students. In that way, the problem-posing educator constantly reforms his reflections in the reflection of the students. The students, no longer docile listeners, are now critical co-investigators in dialogue with the teacher. The teacher presents the material to the students for their consideration and reconsiders her earlier considerations as the students express their own. The role of the problem-posing educator is to create, together with the students, the conditions under which knowledge at the level of the doxa is superseded by true knowledge at the level of the logos. Whereas banking education anesthetizes and inhibits creative power, problem-posing education involves a constant unveiling of reality. The former attempts to maintain the submersion of consciousness. The latter strives for the emergence of consciousness and critical intervention in reality. Excuse me. Students, as they are increasingly posed with problems relating to themselves in the world and with the world, will feel increasingly challenged and obliged to respond to that challenge. Because they apprehend the challenge as interrelated to other problems within a total context, not as a theoretical question, the resulting comprehension tends to be increasingly critical and thus constantly less alienated. Their response to the challenge evokes new challenges, followed by new understandings, and gradually the students come to regard themselves as committed. So that's the difference between having a professor who simply tells you what's to know and then makes sure that you know it on the test in terms of, can you recite these facts back to me? And a professor who says, look at this situation. Have you thought about this situation? Have you seen this? And shows it to you and then demonstrates those things to you, right? Education as the practice of freedom, as opposed to education as the practice of domination. Excuse me. denies that man is abstract, isolated, independent, and unattached to the world. It also denies that the world exists as a reality apart from people. Authentic reflection considers neither abstract man nor the world without people, but people in their relations with the world. In these relations, consciousness and world are simultaneous. Consciousness neither precedes the world nor follows it. And then this is a quote from Sartre, which I'm not able to read, but Leia, if you're able to, you can give us a translation. That'd be great. I think Elle's still here too. Elle might be able to translate. In one of our culture circles in Chile, the group was discussing, based on a codification, the anthropological concept of culture. Note 9, see chapter 3. In the midst of the discussion, a peasant who by banking standards was completely ignorant said, Now I see that without man there is no world. When the educator responded, let's say for the sake of argument, that all the men on the earth were to die, but that the earth itself remained, together with trees, birds, animals, rivers, seas, the stars, wouldn't all this be a world? Oh no, the peasant replied emphatically. There would be no one to say, this is a world. This is the quote. La conscience et le monde sont donnés. You know what I'm saying? I can't get you there. I can't do it. But you see what he's saying here, right? This person understands consciousness, right? And the consciousness that is necessitative of the concept of culture, right? Or the concept of a world. The peasant wished to express the idea that there would be lacking the consciousness of the world, which necessarily implies the world of consciousness. I cannot exist without a non-I. In turn, the not I depends on that existence. The world which brings consciousness into existence becomes the world of that consciousness. Hence the previously cited affirmation of Sartre, La conscience et le monde sont donnés du même coup. The same something? The consciousness of the world, something of the same something? As women and men, simultaneously, it's literally consciousness and the world are given for the same reason. I think, okay, sounds great, Elle. As women and men, simultaneously reflecting on themselves and on the world, increase the scope of their perception. They begin to direct their observations towards previously inconspicuous phenomena. In perception properly so called, as an explicit awareness, Gewahren, I am turned towards the object, to the paper, for instance. I apprehend it as being this here and now. The apprehension is a singling out, every object having a background and experience. Around and about the paper lie books, pencils, inkwell, and so forth, and these in a certain sense are also perceived, perceptually there, in the field of intuition. But whilst I was turned towards the paper, there was no turning in their direction, nor any apprehending of them, not even in a secondary sense. They appeared and yet were not singled out, were not posited on their own account. Every perception of a thing has such a zone of background intuitions or background awareness, if intuiting already includes the state of being turned towards, and this also is a conscious experience, or more briefly, a consciousness of all indeed, that in point of fact lies in the co-perceived objective background. Edmund Husserl, Ideas, General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology. I'm not going to lie, I'm not definitely super understanding that passage, but we can revisit maybe one day. I've given it once. No problem, Elle. Thank you. That which had existed objectively, but had not been perceived in its deeper implications, if indeed it was perceived at all, begins to stand out, assuming the character of a problem and therefore of challenge. Thank you, Vincent. Thus, men and women begin to single out elements from their background awareness and to reflect upon them. These elements are now objects of their consideration, and as such, objects of their action and cognition. We have a lot of French native speakers in here. That's awesome. Shout out to Leo, Vincent. Elle is I know a third language French speaker, I think, but thank you for the French. Thank you to the French speakers. Y'all are great. In problem posing education, people develop their power to perceive critically the way they exist in the world with which and in which they find themselves. They come to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality in process, in transformation. Although the dialectical relations of women and men with the world exist independently of how these relations are perceived, or whether or not they are perceived at all, it is also true that the form of action they adopt is to a large extent a function of how they perceive themselves in the world. Hence, the teacher-student and the students-teachers reflect simultaneously on themselves and the world without dichotomizing this reflection from action, and thus establish an authentic form of thought and action. Once again, the two educational concepts and practices under analysis come into conflict. Banking education, for obvious reasons, attempts, by mythicizing reality, to conceal certain facts which explain the way human beings exist in the world. Problem-posing education sets itself the task of demythologizing. Banking education resists dialogue. Problem-posing education regards dialogue as indispensable to the act of cognition which unveils reality. Banking education treats students as objects of assistance. Problem-posing education makes them critical thinkers. Banking education inhibits creativity and domesticates, although it cannot completely destroy, the intentionality of consciousness by isolating consciousness from the world, thereby denying people their ontological and historical vocation of becoming more fully human. Problem-posing education bases itself on creativity and stimulates true reflection and action upon reality, thereby responding to the vocation of persons as beings who are authentic only when engaged in inquiry and creative transformation. In sum, banking theory and practice, as immobilizing and fixating forces, fail to acknowledge men and women as historical beings. Problem-posing theory and practice take the people's historicity as their starting point. I love that phrase, taking the historicity as the starting point. Problem-posing education affirms men and women as beings in the process of becoming, as unfinished, uncompleted beings in and with a likewise unfinished reality. Indeed, in contrast to other animals who are unfinished but not historical, people know themselves to be unfinished. They are aware of their incompletion. In this incompletion and this awareness lie the very roots of education as an exclusively human manifestation. The unfinished character of human beings and the transformational character of reality necessitate that education be an ongoing activity. Education is thus constantly remade in the praxis. In order to be, it must become. Its duration, in the Bergsonian meaning of the word, is found in the interplay of the opposites permanence and change. The banking method emphasizes permanence and becomes reactionary. Problem-posing education, which accepts neither a well-behaved present nor a predetermined future, roots itself in the dynamic present and becomes revolutionary. Again, the temporal aspect is really important here. Problem-posing education is revolutionary futurity. Hence, it is prophetic and, as such, hopeful. Hence, it corresponds to the historical nature of humankind. Hence, it affirms women and men as beings who transcend themselves, who move forward and look ahead, for whom immobility represents a fatal threat, for whom looking at the past must only be a means of understanding more clearly what and who they are, so that they can more wisely build the future. Hence, it identifies with the movement, which engages people as beings aware of their incompletion. An historical movement which has its point of departure, its subjects, and its objective. Let me know how we're doing so far. The point of departure of the movement lies in the people themselves. But since people do not exist apart from the world, apart from reality, the movement must begin with the human-world relationship. Accordingly, the point of departure must always be with men and women in the here and now, which constitutes the situation within which they are submerged, from which they emerge, and in which they intervene. Only by starting from this situation, which determines their perception of it, can they begin to move. To do this authentically, they must perceive their state not as fated and unalterable, but merely as limiting and therefore challenging. And I love that. I love that so much. Because this is one of the difficulties with us understanding when to try things and when to give up. Not only because we don't think we can do things because we think that they're impossible, but moreover, that we do these things oftentimes, we only have a certain amount of time in the day to choose what we want to do with our lives. And oftentimes, because we recognize something, we see something as practically impossible to achieve in whatever time period we're given to think about it, we see it as impossible per se, when that's not true. Anybody can do not anything, right? I mean, it's practically speaking, anybody can't do anything. But in a more kind of general sense, in a more kind of maybe idealistic sense, anyone can do anything, right? It's just going to be really hard in a lot of cases. Like, if you're not good at chess and you're 25 years old, you can become a grandmaster of chess. It's just going to be really hard. And that's the difference, right? Because it's about, and then you begin to have a real conversation about, okay, well, maybe even though it's really hard, I can do it. And what would be the conditions that I would need to be able to do it? And then that's when we have to talk about conditions. And then that's when we have to talk about class. And we have to talk about work, labor, right? And we have to talk about development of human beings through adulthood. Sarah says, so problem-posing education is ontologically and epistemologically interlocking and intersectional. Right. I think, yeah, like it's about continuously kind of resolving contradictions and understanding us as historical beings. We are in a history. We have conditions in front of us. And thus, we have, based on the information we have about how to do things, we can figure out what is it we can know, we cannot know, what is it we can do, we cannot do, in a, not just in general, not absolutely, but in our relative sense, in the sense of, I know that I cannot become, let's say, I'm not going to become like a high level basketball player. I'm just not, right? But that's not because it's impossible. That's because it's so difficult. It's so challenging. And because the conditions are what make it so. Right? Does that make sense? It's the conditions that make things the way that they are. Not absolute realities that you just memorize. Whereas the banking method directly or indirectly reinforces men's fatalistic perception of their situation, the problem-posing method presents this very situation to them as a problem. As the situation becomes the object of their cognition, the naive or magical perception which produced their fatalism gives way to perception which is able to perceive itself even as it perceives reality, and can thus be critically objective about that reality. A deepened consciousness of their situation leads people to apprehend that situation as an historical reality susceptible of transformation. Resignation gives way to the drive for transformation and inquiry, over which men feel themselves to be in control. If people, as historical beings necessarily engaged with other people in a movement of inquiry, did not control that movement, it would be, and is, a violation of their humanity. Any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. The means used are not important. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to change them into objects. This movement of inquiry must be directed towards humanization, the people's historical vocation. The pursuit of full humanity, however, cannot be carried out in isolation or individualism, but only in fellowship and solidarity. Therefore, it cannot unfold in the antagonistic relations between oppressors and oppressed. No one can be authentically human while he prevents others from being so. Attempting to be more human individualistically leads to having more egotistically, a form of dehumanization. Not that it is not fundamental to have in order to be human. Excuse me. Precisely because it is necessary, some men's having must not be allowed to constitute an obstacle to others' having. Must not consolidate the power of the former to crush the latter. Intercept asks, I'm confused about what is meant by mechanistic when we are talking about process. What is or isn't mechanical about cause and effect? So, mechanical, my interpretation, right, my understanding, is that it becomes mechanistic when outcomes are made absolute, and when especially humans participating in these processes are made objects more than having been recognized as subjects, right? So to be clear, a mechanistic way of viewing what's a good example? A mechanistic way of viewing learning a language is I will put in 2 hours per day over the year to studying Spanish, and in the end, I will know Spanish, right? Now, on the one hand, you can sit here and say the issue with that is that my cause, which is my process, the structure of learning Spanish over a year, does not jive well with the effect, which is that I will learn Spanish, right? That can be a matter of subjective opinion in terms of how much you think it's going to take to learn Spanish in that period of time. But that's part of the point, right? Because to say studying Spanish for a year will make you learn Spanish is to leave out so many important details that would be part of that process, as well as to not have a great formulation posited about what it even means to learn Spanish. So let me explain the first part. You can study Spanish for a year. Are you studying well? Are you studying Spanish in a way that meets your needs? Are you studying Spanish in the ways that have been more proven to be effective in learning the language versus not as effective because you're just watching YouTube videos, for instance, or you're just putting those videos on while you take a nap that are you'll memorize Spanish if you listen to this in your sleep every night, right? What is it you're actually doing in the studying? How are you studying? What's your state of mind as you're studying? What subjects are you studying? What content are you studying? Who are you? Who are you? What languages do you know already? Because if you already speak Portuguese, if you take a year where you're studying Spanish, you You can see how that would be enable you to learn the language easier through a lot of the different, same strategies or even different strategies, right? What would be also, and this is the second part, what would it mean to learn Spanish, right? I mean, this is seems kind of like we're getting arbitrary or abstract, but it means something, right? It's important. What does it mean to learn Spanish? What does it mean to know Spanish? To know Spanish, we generally say, oh, you'll be able to speak fluently, right? But even people who are fluent in Spanish, there are going to be things that they don't know. There are going to be times where they don't, come across like they're that well spoken in the language a lot of the times. Even people who don't seem like they speak Spanish that well might be able to speak at a higher level than somebody who has a nicer accent than them, but maybe doesn't have the processing in Spanish as good, as high level. And you can also lose a language. Are you going to stop studying Spanish? Are you going to stop using your Spanish after you've done the year of learning? Well, yeah, you can learn Spanish, you can know Spanish, and then you could lose a lot of it because you're not using it. You forget it. What's a more helpful understanding is first understanding learning as a process. You can learn Spanish every day. In a lot of ways, you can argue you are learning Spanish every day just through like passive absorption. It's very slow learning and not super effective if you have a goal at learning Spanish, but you could say that you are, right? But, we see it as this mechanistic cause and effect. I will simply put this input in and then I will receive this output. Versus it is a process that is continuous and that has to be measured and understood based on the conditions at play, based on who I am, what I'm doing, where I'm doing it, when, why, how, and based on a concept of a goal that is very finish line oriented, very objective, mechanistic oriented, output oriented, and not very lifelike, which is communication oriented, which is process oriented. So yeah, I mean, like, I saw a TikTok recently, earlier today, about this person who was taking a quiz about autism to see if they have autism. And it's really funny because they were saying, like, autism quiz, autism quizzes need to have better questions. They're too vague. For instance, this question is asking me, do I want to go to a party or do I want to go to the library? And I don't know, what's the nature of the party? Is the party gonna be really fun? Am I gonna know the people there? What kind of stuff are they gonna have there? What time is it? How am I feeling? And what's the library like? Is it like one of those really cool libraries? Is it huge? Is it one of the, like, what are the kind of conditions, right? And so in some ways it's like complicating the information, but in a more important way, it's about the recognition of things as processes. Part of what you get from complicating understandings and adding context, contextualizing understandings, is the ability to actually apply an understanding of something to the real world, right? Versus when you just know it in this abstract, in this very simple way, first of all, you don't engage with how true it is and how and what situations, and then how to actually apply it in day-to-day life. Wrongly reductive oversimplification, I think, gets at part of the problem. But I think the biggest problem is maybe the second point that I was making about the Spanish learning thing, which is it recognizes something as being static, mechanistic, input, output. I do this, I get this. It is static, right? But learning is not static. Life is not static. Understanding, education is not static. So that's the bigger problem. And I'll explain why. It's because most of the people, have you noticed, that are really good at speaking many languages recognize that their language learning is a constant process. That they're never done learning. Even if they consider themselves to be very high level at speaking a different language, they're like, well, I'm fascinated by it. I still like learning from it. I still like talking to people in that language, and I still try to be humble about when I can make mistakes. Anybody who's really good at something, 95% of the time they're going to tell you it's a process of constantly trying to progress through learning, through interaction. And so what mechanistic thinking does is the complete opposite, which is to say X is X and will always be X in a sense, but more so that's the best way to view life. Is the same way that I would view a math equation, right? And math equations help us understand life. They do not depict actual life. Do you understand? Animated Human asks, hope you can answer this. Do you think the teacher-student with student-teacher applies to STEM, which is itself a very mechanistic field? Yes. Because, and I'm not a great STEM expert, so some of y'all who are better at STEM might be able to answer this. But this is a huge problem in the STEM field. And part of why there's such an emphasis to teach STEM folks the humanities. Not just because it's like, oh, well, you're using your STEM information for the wrong reasons because you don't understand things like freedom and socialism or whatever. But because science is process, right? And the scientific process it cannot be dogma. It cannot be mechanistic. It has to be something that you're constantly looking at, tinkering with. This is part of why with science, like, there are very few laws. There are many theories that are practically everything like, resemble a law to us, but are actually like not. Because there has to remain this constant curiosity towards, is this thing actually true? We are still learning. All of the great scientists will tell you, we are still learning. There's so much that we don't know. And that's how it's basically always going to be. And it's not a matter of we understand 60% of the world and we're trying to get to understand 100% eventually. And then when we understand 100%, our job is done. Rather, we're going to constantly be understanding over and over again. And it's the fact that we are engaging with that process of constantly trying to understand with it, constantly studying it, constantly learning. That is what gives to others the appearance of us having the thing, the appearance of us statically being these experts. But an expert stops being an expert the moment they stop engaging consistently with the subject. Somebody who could be seen as an expert in physiology. I don't know what physiology actually is. Somebody could be considered an expert in heart science, and then for 2 years they just stop keeping up with the academia on heart science. They stop engaging with their previous knowledge about heart science. They stop thinking about the heart in general like that. They're not an expert anymore. The expertise is the process. It is a praxis, right? It is not a destination. It is not a static object. Yeah, process-oriented is far better than goal-oriented. Goals are, the thing is, goals are really, really necessary to anchor the process. Do you know what I mean? So if I'm saying I want to learn Spanish, I want to have like goals that I hit which keep me moving towards a certain direction. So I can say, well, now I finally understand, I'm trying to remember the freaking, I'm like, should I use Spanish grammar shit too? It's like, I don't know. I understand how to use, subjunctive tense. Finally. So that's a thing to check off the list. But even if, for instance, I decide that the process should have a final goal, and once I hit that goal, I'm done. In reality, I'm not actually done. Right? If I want to continue to say I am a, let's say C1 level Spanish speaker, that's my goal. And so when I hit C1 level, I've done all the things, I've hit all those goals, I've been part of that process, and I hit C1. As soon as I stop doing the things that get me to that level, engaging with the language and learning the language and using the language, right? As soon as I stop, I'm going to decline in that level. So me maintaining a C1 level of Spanish speaking is itself the process. It's just that the goals changed from I'm going to progress higher and higher to I'm going to stay at C1, maintain my current level, maintain my current physique for a lot of like physical sort of understandings, right? Of like working out. So that's the big thing. And that's the thing that people with education, like it's all screwed up. That's what Freire's talking about. And it's all screwed up because we have it totally as this understanding of get goal, get goal, get goal, get goal. The process is not important. The goal is what's important. And so, for one, we don't actually engage with the actual learning of something that the goal is meant for. We're just trying to indicate that we've reached the goal so that we can get the prize of graduating. But for two, there is no understanding in the first place of the process being the thing. There's no understanding of it. There's no emphasis of it. It's only about receiving things. Right? Mechanical, I mean, organic, or like, even not to say just organic, but like life is sometimes rule following too. But we follow those rules knowing that we've set those rules and what they're for. That's the difference. We set those rules, we know generally what they're for, and we don't see them as dogmas. We don't see them as constantly true or having to be constantly true. We just use them to keep structure in our lives. Because at a certain point, we need structure. Thank you so much, Ultar. Yeah, I mean, it would be impossible for any country to base their school system on Freire's work immediately because they are owned by the elite classes. And this is something he was talking about earlier in this class. He has no sense that people would just automatically start changing to, we'll just have like a problem-posing education instead of banking education now. Because that's not what the elites want. The oppressors, the elites do not want that because that engages the students to then act in the world and change the world. And the elites don't want that, All right. We're almost done with the chapter. Thank you so much, Blink Bubs. I'm glad you see what I mean? Okay. Problem-posing education as a humanist and liberating praxis. It's just so hard sometimes. Problem-posing education as a humanist and liberating praxis posits as fundamental that the people subjected to domination must fight for their emancipation. To that end, it enables teachers and students to become subjects of the educational process by overcoming authoritarianism and an alienating intellectualism. It also enables people to overcome their false perception of reality. The world, no longer something to be described with deceptive words, becomes the object of that transforming action by men and women, which results in their humanization. Como profe de español estoy completamente de acuerdo. Exactamente, Lorena. Muchas gracias. Ironically, sometimes the way you and my professors teach these ideas is amazing to me, and I have this moment of, holy shit, you said that perfectly. And I have to step back and not then assume professor equals fact. Exactly, Sarah. Like, your part of this process is just as important as mine. Yo también tengo mucho que aprender. Exacto. Tengo mucho que aprender es algo que uno puede decir en cualquier nivel, en cualquier disciplina. Es una de esas mantras más importantes. Problem-posing education does not and cannot serve the interests of the oppressor. No oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question why. While only a revolutionary society can carry out this education in systematic terms, the revolutionary leaders need not take full power before they can employ the method. In the revolutionary process, the leaders cannot utilize the banking method as an interim measure, justified on grounds of expediency, with the intention of later behaving in a genuinely revolutionary fashion. They must be revolutionary, that is to say, dialogical, from the outset. Revolutionary and dialogical. We synonym them. They're synonymous. That's the chapter. Big decolonialized abrazo from Mexico for you, Elliot. Gracias, Diosa. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming to this amazing chapter 2 reading. I did so good. It was great. Stay tuned. I think I will aim for a Wednesday stream. I will aim for a Wednesday stream of chapter 3 to give myself a bit of time to finish this video, to get a bunch of other activities done, and to also reread chapter 3 before reading it to y'all. And yeah, until then, please stay safe. Please be happy. No, you don't have to be happy. It's fine. But please stay safe. Please keep reading and studying. I hope that this has been really, revelatory and interesting and helpful for you. Gracias por todo. Gracias, Joaquin. And yeah, take care. Have a great day.